Welcome back Year 9 to another exciting class on indices and surds. Now we're going to be dealing with indices with fractions, and we're going to also introduce the concept of surds. So it's a very challenging exercise, this one. So it's going to take some practice and some time to master this. So if you're struggling a little bit, that is quite normal. Let's get into it. Now, first thing we need to talk about is when you're dealing with indices, if your power, remember an index is a power or an exponent, if your power is a fraction, what you're actually writing is a surd. So for example, if I have something like this, 2 to the power of 3, we're used to seeing something like that, that ends up equaling 8. But if I have 2 to the power of a half, that actually ends up being a surd, which means that if we put that into the calculator, it's a decimal that goes on forever and ever. It's an irrational number. But we'll talk more about that in a little while. So, here's our rule. And it looks a little bit weird, but it's how we change fractional indices into surd form. And remember, a surd has one of these radical signs, like a square root sign. So, for example, let's say I have something like this. I have a to the power of 3/5. Well, as soon as you see that the power is a fraction, you know your answer is going to be a surd. The base, which in this case is a, goes under the surd sign. Now this is the tricky part. Now I've written it here, and this is not found in your textbook. You will not find this concept in your textbook. But I think it's a good way to remember things. If we have a to the power of a fraction, I'm going to call the top of the fraction t, t for top, the bottom of the fraction b, b for the bottom of the fraction. When we have our little surd symbol, I want you to imagine that this piece here is like a little seat you can just sit on. And when you sit on a seat, you sit on the seat with your bottom. And if your bottom is sitting on the seat, that means the number on the bottom of the fraction must go on the seat of the surd sign. So for this question, there's a 5 on the bottom of the fraction, so we put a 5 there. There's a 3 on the top of the fraction, and we put a 3 there, and that's our answer. You could also write it like this. Put your 5 on the seat, put your a there, and you could put it all in brackets and go to the power of 3, but this is the one we will typically use. So I'm just going to try it with a different one now. Let's go 5 to the power of 7 over 11. Oh, when I looked at this, the power is a fraction, which means that this is actually a surd. What's sitting on the seat out the front of the surd? The bottom of the fraction is 11. The base is 5, and the power at the top is a 7, and that is converting something from index form into surd form because there is a fractional power. So, let's look at the rule that's actually listed in your textbook. It's saying if you have a to the power of 1 over m, remember m is the number on the bottom of the fraction, and so if it's on the bottom, it's the bit that's sitting on the seat, it's the bit that goes out the front of the seat. So this is like a partial use of the formula that we just talked about. So let's try this. Let's convert 4 to the power of a half into surd form. Well, the answer is square root 4, but how did I get that? So remember, 4 to the power of a half. As soon as you see there's a fractional power, you know it's a surd. Because the base is 4, it's a 4. What's on the bottom of the fraction? A 2. What's on the top of the fraction? A 1. Now, something you may or not be aware of is that when you see a square root sign, it is assumed that you understand that there's a 2 there, but we never normally write it. And to the power of 1, we don't have to write. So those bits in green, we don't bother writing, so it's just square root 4. And the square root of 4 is 2. Let's try this one. 100 to the power of a half. Well, if we look at this, on the bottom of the fraction is a 2. It is a fraction, so I'm going to have square root of 100. And what's sitting on the seat? A little 2, but we don't need to write it. And there's a 1 there, and we don't need to write that. The square root of 100 is 10. So really what I would like you to be able to know off by heart is that when you have a fraction that is a half, anything to the power of a half just means the square root of that number. Now, to the power of third is a little bit different. What's on the bottom of the fraction is a 3. So when we actually do this question, we know it's 8 to the power of 1/3 because it's a fraction. We're going to put a surd sign. The base is 8. What's sitting on the seat? The bottom of the fraction. The bottom sits on the seat, the third, and there's your power of 1. So you get the cube root of 8. And the cube root of 8 is 2, because 2 times 2 times 2 is 8. I'm not as interested in the answer. I'm more interested that you can convert from 8 to the power of a third to the cube root of 8. Change from index form to surd form. Let's continue. 125 to the power of minus a third. Now we're getting tricky because not only do we have a fraction, but we've got a minus sign. Now we've dealt with minuses before. Remember, if you've got a minus sign, think about it like this. If I move all of that across the fraction line, that will give me, let's actually write it here. It gives me 1 over 125 to the power of a third. Now, the 1 on the top stays there in my final answer. What's 125 to the power of a third? Well, 125 to the power of a third, because it's to the power of a fraction, means I introduce a square root sign. And on the bottom of the fraction is a 3, and it's 125 there. Now, the cube root of 125, if you put it into your calculator, is 5, because 5 times 5 times 5 gives 125, which means that'll become 1 over 5. They are tricky, as I said. Takes lots of practice to master these. Let's try the next one. This one just says to put this into your calculator and write the answer to 4 decimal places. So just on your calculator, 34, and then push your power button. Now your power button is a button that looks something like this. There is an X, and then there's a little box, and that's the button you're looking for. That's your power button. So you'll go 34, then push your power button, then type in 1 over 6 using your fraction button, and you'll end up with your answer that looks like that. Keeps on going forever. But it says to 4 decimal places, so I want 1, 2, 3, 4 decimal places. That 9 is going to round things up, which means I get 1.7999 if I round it to 4 decimal places. Let's try this one on the calculator. 300 to the power of 3 over 8. There's my answer. To 4 decimal places. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's a 4, so it's not going to round up. It'll stay as it is. It's 8.4902. Now, this question says to write it in surd form. Well, remember, 55 to the power of a half. Well, as soon as you see a power, that is a fraction, you know you've got a surd. We've got 55. What's sitting on the seat out the front? Your bottom sits on the seat, so it's a 2. And so you get the square root of 55. Remember, I said before, anything to the power of a half means the square root of that number. What about 5 to the power of 1/3? Well, because it's to the power of 1/3, we know it's a fraction, or power, so we have a surd. What's sitting on the bottom? Sitting on the seat is your bottom, 3. So it is the cube root of 5. Let's go to our next example. Now, even though we've got fractional values, this just says simplify. So when you are multiplying powers, sorry, I'll say that again. When you are multiplying indices, you add the two powers together. So the base in this case is f. What we have to do is look at the 2/5 and the 1/5 and add them together. Now 2 over 5 plus 1 over 5 is 3 over 5. Now if you can't do the fractions because they're messy fractions in your head, you just type them into your calculator. But that's your answer. When you're timesing indices, you plus the powers. Remember when we had a power to a power? So this is x to the power of 3, all to the power of a 6. So when you have a power to a power, you times the powers. You either do in your head or on your calculator, 3 times 1/6. And when you do that, you'll get a half. So the answer is x to the power of a half, if you simplify that. When you're dividing, doesn't matter if the powers are fractional, when you're dividing, you minus the powers. If you do a half minus a third, might be easier to do that on your calculator, you'll get 1/6. So the answer is a to the power of 1/6. Now, example 5 says to give me the final answer, evaluate the following without using your calculator. That means I need to show, or you need to show, all of the steps involved in the working out. If you just write the answer only, that is not going to get you any marks. Now, we need to first rewrite this question using positive indices because it's 9 to the power of minus a half. Now remember, 9 to the power of minus a half can be thought of as 9 to the power of minus a half over 1. And we take that and move it across the fraction, and that gives you 1 over 9 to the power of a half. So let's see if we can write that down. Now, looking at the bottom of the fraction, anything to the power of a half is able to be written in surd form. Now, 9 to the power of a half, because it's a fractional power, means what's sitting on the bottom at the front of 2. It means the square root of 9. So when we actually continue that through, it's 1 over the square root of 9. What is the square root of 9 on the bottom of the fraction? Square root of 9 is 3, so it becomes 1 over 3. So we've explained all of the steps all the way through, and we've actually figured out that 9 to the minus a half is in fact a third, and we didn't use a calculator to get that answer. Let's try it again. 8 to the power of minus 1/3. Well, remember, 8 to the power of minus 1/3 over 1, you move that across the fraction line, and that's going to be the same as 1 over 8 to the power of 1/3. Now what is 8 to the power of 1/3? Well, we know that because it's a fraction power, we're going to introduce a surd sign. What's sitting on the bottom out the front? A 3. So when we're doing this question, 8 to the power of 1/3 is in fact the cube root of 8, which we can see here. What is the cube root of 8? 2 times 2 times 2 gives 8. The cube root of 8 is 2. So this answer works out to be a half. Now, we're going to introduce surds, but before we introduce surds, we need to understand something. We have numbers that we use in a day-to-day or every day, and they're called real numbers. But real numbers are broken into two parts. Numbers that can be written as a fraction and numbers that cannot be written as a fraction. They're called rational and irrational. So, what you need to understand is a surd is a type of irrational number. So just because we have one of these signs, it doesn't make it a surd, because the square root of 4 is 2, and 2 is the same as 2 over 1, which is rational because I've just written it as a fraction. But if I tried the square root of 3, that's 1.732, blah, 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 it goes on forever and ever and ever. That can't be written as a fraction because it's a decimal that goes on forever with no pattern. So that one is irrational. So how are you able to tell if something is irrational or rational? Well, when you're dealing with square roots, think of these numbers. 2 times 2 gives 4. 3 times 3 gives 9. 4 times 4, 5 times 5, 6 times 6, and so on. If you do the square root of any one of those numbers, they actually drop out nicely, so you do not have a surd because these are called perfect squares. If you have any other number, then it's not going to be rational, it will be a surd. Notice I didn't put 1 there. 1 times 1 is 1. That actually drops out to become rational, but it's not going to help me for the work I'm doing later on, so we'll see why in a moment. So, state whether the following numbers are surds or not. Probably would be better language. Let's talk about the square root of 5. If you do the square root of 5 on your calculator, it's a messy decimal. Because it's a messy decimal, it's a surd. It's irrational. We can't write it as a fraction. 0.64, try that on your calculator and it's 0.8. Hey, that's a decimal that doesn't continue forever, which means that's not a surd. That's rational, and the reason it's rational is 0.8 is the same as 8 over 10, because that's the tenths column with fractions, with decimals. So that can be written as a fraction. It can be written as 8 over 10. You're not going to get many questions like that. The cube root of 27, do that on your calculator and it equals 3, which means that is not a surd. It's rational. 3 can be written as 3 over 1. The fifth root of 25, it's a decimal that appears to go on and on and on, which means that's going to be a surd. It's irrational. Rightio, let's try example 2 where you've got to find the square root of 41 to 2 decimal places. Put it into your calculator. That's what it looks like, but to 2 decimal places, we go 2 numbers after the decimal. That's a 3, so it's not going to round up, which means we get 6.40 if we take it to 2 decimal places. Time for you to try some questions. Enjoy the experience. Bye for now.